So on to tonight. Matt Phelps previously worked with Sussex Wildlife Trust as our Species Recovery Officer. He now works as lead ecologist at Knepp, and tonight he's going to be delving into the wonderful world of species reintroductions. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Well, it's great to be here, everyone. It's always quite surreal doing these online ones because I can't actually see any of you, but hope you're all sitting comfortably, and hopefully those of you who may have been at the AGM back in November, there's a bit of repetition of some of what I covered on that, so hopefully it won't be too repetitive, but I've added in lots of new stuff as well, particularly on beavers, as we've had some new updates on beavers in the last couple of weeks, as you may have seen. As Jane mentioned, I thought I'd just do a little introduction to myself at the beginning for those of you who might not know me or what I've done. So as Jane said, I'm the lead ecologist at the Knepp rewilding estate near Horsham. I've been in that post about 5 months now. And prior to that, I was at the Sussex Wildlife Trust, as Jane said, which was as species recovery officer. And that was kind of covering all aspects of the Trust's approach to species recovery, a lot of which I'm going to be explaining to you tonight. But there was a particular focus on beavers and pine martens, hence the title of this talk. I'm also a very keen birder in my spare time, and when I do occasionally have a bit of spare time, I review bird records for the SOS and eBird. And some of you may have seen I wrote a book which came out last year about birds in Surrey and Sussex, and various other writing things related to that. So that's a bit about me. But the topic of the talk tonight is species reintroductions and species recovery. So sort of encompassing that job title that I had at the Wildlife Trust. It's what is species recovery, basically. It's a term that many of you may have heard. Handily enough, there is a definition from the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and I won't read that out entirely, but it's quite simply a species which is recovered to the point where it is functioning and it is present and doing all the things it would have done naturally across an area of its range, hopefully its entire range. That can mean sort of filling in the gaps, or it can mean a population is just hanging on by a thread and you basically build it back up from there. But when we talk about species recovery, what we're looking for is that kind of graph at the bottom. Obviously, it sort of goes without saying that if you want a species to be recovered, you want to see numbers going up, and it just so happens that graph is representing beavers. So in order to do that, to recover species, there's lots of different ways you can approach it. So in some cases, it can be simply stopping doing something. So the more we understand now about conservation and the threats to species, if we remove those damaging factors and the things that are causing the decline, sometimes habitats recover and species recover by themselves, but by and large. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. But sometimes we actually have to intervene. And by that, I mean we have to actually recreate habitat which is very damaged or has been lost entirely. So you're sort of starting from further back in the time scale. And sometimes we actually look to reintroduction for one of the solutions to recover a species. So it can be a combination of all of the above. Sometimes it involves intervention on some level, sometimes more than others. But when we talk about reintroduction, it's a case of actively bringing something back that is no longer present. An example of something where that didn't need to happen, just to give you an idea of the different approach, at Knepp, where I now work, we've had a number of species which have recovered by themselves and have just reappeared because we've allowed the landscape to return to a more process-driven natural state. And that's things like this violet door beetle. So the Geotrupes mutata hadn't been recorded in Sussex for decades, 50 or 60 years, and it reappeared at Knepp just a few years ago, presumably because elements of the habitat were returning to a favourable condition for them, and there was a lot more dung from the animals, for example. Now, a really good example of that, which the Wildlife Trust obviously is a key partner in, is the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project, where this is all about allowing a landscape or a subterranean landscape to recover by itself and taking away the damaging factors. So there was the trawling ban, which happened a few years ago, prevented that damaging activity from taking place any longer within a protected zone. And then it's a case of monitoring what happens. And the thing with kelp, and I'll get onto this later on, but the kelps, the group of species we call kelps, they are keystone species. And actually, if you allow them to come back, you sometimes see this sort of this knock-on effect, this sort of domino effect of all of the species which relied on the kelp can also then return as well. So that's a really good example of kind of stepping back and letting nature do it for you. But what about where that's not an option? So that's when we have to talk about species reintroduction, or we can think about species reintroduction as an option. I've purposely chosen the black vein white there. That is a species that has been extinct in Britain for exactly 100 years. You occasionally get odd ones popping up, most likely from unauthorized releases. So people just sort of dump them here, there, and everywhere. There was a release last year in sort of South London, you might have read about. But this is a species that is not going to come back by and large on its own. And this is the definition from the IUCN. So reintroduction is where you purposefully bring a species from one place to another. That will always be a species that is not, generally speaking, entirely extinct. Obviously, if it's completely extinct, we're into the realms of sort of Jurassic Park. There are people working on that. I saw a really interesting talk from an organization in America recently where they are looking at sort of back breeding, and they're trying to bring back species which are globally extinct. That's a whole different matter altogether, and slightly verging on science fiction. But what we're talking about is species that are still present somewhere, but they're not present in a particular area. And obviously, with the UK being an island off the coast of Europe, we have this particular issue where once we've lost a species and it's only, say, in Southern Europe, we have more of a challenge to get it back. And that's where reintroduction can come in. So species which we would consider or could consider for reintroduction, those which are completely gone from an entire region and have been for a very long period of time, or quite a long period of time. So a good example of that would be something like beavers, or going even further back, sort of things like elk, for example. Species which are gone from a particular place, a whole country or a whole region for a long period of time. You've got species which have been lost more recently, for example, and potentially clinging on very, very light, very, very thinly. Red-backed shrike, the bird on the right there, is a good example of that. So it's just been lost as a breeding species in kind of in living memory, really. They were still breeding fairly widespread in the sort of middle of the 20th century across the UK, and we still get red-backed shrikes every year. So there will be these birds that come through from Scandinavia through to where on their migration south. And occasionally you'll get a breeding attempt. So last year there was quite a few in the country in the spring, and there was at least one breeding attempt. So they're gone, but they're not 100% gone. So we're sort of clinging on to them. And then there's species which are still here, but maybe in very reduced numbers and in very fragmented populations. And that can create all sorts of problems with inbreeding, for example. An example of that would be, to use another bird, black grouse. So black grouse in the UK, we only have sort of 4,000 or 5,000 left, and they're in very isolated pockets. So that is not ideal for the long-term sustainability of that species. Pros of reintroduction, quite sort of self-explanatory. You get the target population, the target species back, that in itself. So you hopefully succeed in that regard. But there can actually be a lot of knock-on benefits to other species as well. And it depends what we're talking about here. I'll go into detail later on how beavers, for example, unlock a lot of other ecosystem functions. So if you reintroduce beavers, you're sort of actually potentially opening the door for other species as well, like water vole, for example. And then there's species which we maybe would do a lot of habitat work on to actually benefit that species, but it will also have positive impacts for other species as well. I'm going to give examples of all of these as we go on. There's also this kind of relatively new sector as well, ecotourism. Wasn't that long ago that unfortunately a lot of species people would shoot things and hunt species, and in the UK a lot of stuff was wiped out because of that. Now we're into a totally different era where people are much more inclined to go and travel to pay and see iconic species and enjoy them and take photos of them. And it's worth a huge amount of money, as it says there, over $1 billion a year in the UK. There's also educational opportunities as well, and by that I mean sort of curriculum education, so school groups and what have you. But there's also just the wider population, educating people about the species we once had and lost and why they've gone. And that actually leads on to this next point, which is nature connectedness. We talk a lot about the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and there's this kind of other one that's bubbling away, which is the disconnection crisis. We cannot value what we have if we don't understand it. So in order to get people to sort of love nature and understand why it's important to have species back, we have to get back that connectedness. Just an example here of a species that is a bit of a mix of coming back by itself, but also being helped along. So the cell bunting, some of you may have seen down in the West Country, they were clinging on. There was just sort of about 100 pairs or so in the West Country, just restricted to a very few sites. And it was a joint project with the RSPB and others to restore the habitat, but also do some sort of select translocations and move birds to these new areas of suitable habitat. And actually, the breeding population has shot up just in the last sort of 30 or 40 years. We've got, as it says there now, over 1,000 pairs. And that picture I took there of that male, some of you may have seen this bird. He was holding territory down in the sort of near Brighton, sort of Portslade area for several weeks last year. And it was just absolutely incredible to see this species coming all the way back up, breeding in Dorset now. It's kind of unfortunately missed Hampshire. Feel a bit sorry for the Hampshire birders, but it's come back seemingly to Sussex by itself, and it'll be really interesting to see if that's the beginning of a new recovery in this area. I just wanted to say at this point that species reintroduction is not a new thing. It's kind of seen as quite en vogue at the moment, and a lot of people are talking about it. Actually, this picture on the right, and I can't do the sort of interactive element where I ask people what they think that is because I can't see any of you. But that is from a book published in 1678. It's supposed to be a capercaillie. If you've seen a capercaillie, I'm not sure. It kind of looks like one. But what a lot of people don't realise is we have capercaillie now in the UK, just about. But actually, we lost them for a very long time, or for over a century, 150 years or so. We didn't have them, or longer than that. So actually, the only reason we have any capercaillie at all in the UK right now is because of a reintroduction that took place in the 1830s on a private estate, Taymouth Castle. And it was kind of widely acknowledged, as it says there, as the first kind of official determined reintroduction of a species. Obviously, things are slightly different now in terms of how we do it. And unfortunately, the capercaillie is now not doing so well. And that is because this kind of guidance didn't exist in the 1800s. So now, when we talk about species reintroductions, there are a very strict set of criteria about what must be met by any proposed reintroduction. Doesn't matter if it's capercaillie or beavers or even a butterfly. You have to comply with these regulations. This guidance document, which covers everything from the disease risk to the animals, how you're going to promote genetic diversity, where are you going to get the animals from, for example. And the really crucial one there, have the factors that led to the extinction or the decline been resolved? Now, in the case of the capercaillie, clearly that wasn't the case. And whatever it is, there's a multi-factorial sort of threats to the capercaillie. It hasn't been resolved, and it's probably got even worse in terms of the amount of sort of deer fencing and things like that around. So unfortunately, that's why we're losing capercaillie very rapidly now. And then there's this sort of last point as well, which ties in with what I was saying earlier. What does the species do? So it's not just necessarily about releasing kind of species X into the environment. You actually want to think about how it fits into the wider jigsaw, if you like. I often use a jigsaw metaphor to talk about a kind of fully functioning ecosystem. And that leads on nicely to talk about this, some kind of terminology that you may be familiar with, you may be not familiar with. Keystones, flagships, and umbrellas. And these are terms which are applied to different species and how they perform different roles within an ecosystem. So Keystone is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's coined because of the idea of the top of an archway. If you take that stone away, the whole archway doesn't stay up anymore. And this is applied to species which are fundamental to the functioning of an ecosystem. And a really good example of that is kind of any apex predator by and large, because they determine the whole structure of the ecosystem of the other populations. But something like a beaver is a keystone species as well, and I'll get onto that later. Even pollinating insects, ants, anything that has a really important role to play in an ecosystem is a keystone. A flagship species is something which is usually quite charismatic, quite an attractive species, and that's often used to sort of drive wider conservation work. So you will be sort of honing in on that species and doing a lot of fundraising and habitat recovery and all that sort of thing, but it will actually potentially have knock-on benefits to other species as well. And then that's sort of linked to the umbrella species, which is sort of similar, but umbrella species are more to do with sort of the habitat work being the priority, and then the one species will oversee lots of other benefits as well. But here's a good diagram to sort of illustrate the idea of a keystone species. As I mentioned, predators are often sort of described when we talk about keystone species because of that knock-on impact. If you don't have predators in an ecosystem, as we have in the UK, we've lost all our apex predators, you get an abundance of all the kind of middle tier of species. So that's your mesopredators, as they're called, and things like deer, herbivores, which are not being predated by anything at all. So the apex predator in an appropriate landscape returns balance to the ecosystem. And the example that people often give is Yellowstone National Park. So famously, not that long ago, in the last few decades, just a handful of wolves were reintroduced at Yellowstone National Park, and the impacts that were witnessed were extraordinary. So just in sort of less than 20 years, there was this boom in vegetation, and that's not something that was necessarily predicted, but it was largely driven by the wolves moving the deer away from certain areas. You have a wolf pack sort of circulating in a landscape, and quite sort of obviously the prey animals will move away from where the wolves are. So wherever the wolves kind of settle for a bit, you get a bit of a boom in vegetation. Now, where this happens, for example, near rivers in Yellowstone National Park, you then get more vegetation for beavers to feed on. And there's more opportunities for beavers to build dams. That leads to more fish spawning in the rivers. That produces more food for bears, etc. So you get these kind of cascades, what we call trophic cascades. We used to think that food chains and ecosystems always worked from the bottom up, but this idea now is something that is pretty widely accepted, that actually the predator can dominate, dictate is the word I'm looking for, the structure of the whole ecosystem. Really good film to watch on that is the Serengeti Rules. If you've not seen it, it really explains that system really well. And as I said already, the kind of elephant in the room, if you like, is we don't have that in the UK. So when we're thinking about functioning ecosystems and species recovery, one of the things that is absent is the predator. That is why control of certain species is carried out on nature reserves to protect certain other species, because there's nothing else that is doing it for us. And that leads on to talking about somewhere I know very well, which is Knepp in West Sussex, and I'm sure many of you will know it. And hopefully, if you haven't been, you will be inspired to go after this talk. The whole ethos of what's happened at Knepp is restoring natural processes through returning certain animals to the landscape. Now, interestingly, the animals that have been chosen, with the exception of one, are not actually true native species. So we don't have things like wild cattle anymore. We don't have wild horses, and we're not allowed to release wild boar legally in the UK at present. So we have these proxy species. We have the Tamworth pigs, Exmoor ponies, longhorn cattle, and fallow deer, and red deer, which is the only true native. But what these animals do, and you'll see some of the deer in a moment here, is they bring back disturbance. They bring back elements to the landscape which have been fundamentally missing for a very long time. And actually, landscapes need this sort of they need disturbance. We think of nature reserves obviously being very protected and precious sites, which they are, and with good reason if there's sort of particularly rare species there. But also something like disturbance of the sward from a pig can actually sort of kickstart a whole load of other processes as well. And I've got some examples of that here. For example, this is a Iron Age pig photographed in Kent. Any pig is sort of relevant here because pigs and boar, one of the things they do most of all is they do that rootling of the ground. You've already seen it in the previous slide. They're looking for food under the surface like worms and acorns and beetle grubs. And in the process, they create germination opportunities. So if you fast forward a few months from a pig digging over the ground, you get these sort of seedy patches, weedy patches in the ground, in the bare ground. And that is beneficial for birds like turtle dove. That is one of our most threatened bird species in Britain, one which we could lose entirely as a breeding species in a decade at their current trajectory. But at Knepp, we'd seen the population increase really significantly. We had 21 breeding pairs of turtle dove last year, and we haven't done any reintroduction at all. So that is simply a case of having more of that disturbance, more of the plants available to them, more of the habitat as well. So the way in which the land is allowed to recover. We have more thorny scrub, which is where the turtle doves nest. So you suddenly have far more opportunities for these birds in this landscape without having to do very much at all. Another good example of that with the pigs again is the bare ground they create becoming habitat for things like mining bees. So we have a lot of interesting bees at Knepp. A lot of them will nest actually in those bare patches created by the pigs. And suddenly you get things like this. This is Villa cingulata, the downland Villa bee fly. Hadn't been recorded at Knepp at all until about 5 years ago, and suddenly started popping up. And now in the summer, we are tripping over them. They are absolutely everywhere. And that is because they lay their eggs in the mining bee nest holes. They are a parasite of the mining bees. So it all starts with the pigs, the mining bees, and then you get that bee fly. So it's all about these processes, and these are things which can be quite unpredictable. But what happens somewhere like Knepp, we can then obviously learn from that and potentially apply it somewhere else. Now, the title of the talk obviously was Beavers to Pine Marten. So I'm going to get straight on to talking about beavers because they're one of my sort of specialist and favourite subjects. Here's a bit of footage of one at Knepp a couple of years ago. You may know that we have a pair in an enclosure at Knepp, which have been present for about 3 years now. This is one of the ones being released. They're a lot bigger than people realise. Something that when we think about, aquatic mammals, we're used to seeing things maybe, if you're lucky, like water voles, and if you're very lucky, an otter. But this is considerably larger, as you can see from that image there. They're actually the second largest rodent in the world, after the capybara, and the biggest rodent in Europe. And as it says there, they can be almost a metre long, or over a metre long if you include the tail. And 20 kilos or so in terms of weight, but we have recorded ones that are sort of 30 to 35 kilos. There's only 2 species of beaver in the world. There's the castor fiber, the European beaver, and canadensis, which is the North American beaver. Now, unfortunately, like so many species, and that is why we're having this talk tonight, we've nearly lost European beavers altogether. Not so long ago, if you went back a couple of 100 years, there were only a very small number left. And it shows you there those little pockets, those sort of yellowy, pale pockets in sort of Eastern Europe and in towards Russia. And there's a little bit down in the south of France. Those were the only places pretty much in Germany you would find beavers not so long ago. And we were down to, fewer than 1,000 pretty much. Thankfully, the population is recovering really well. And on the near continent, because it's a continuous landmass, the beavers which have been, they're no longer persecuted, and some translocation has gone on, and it's enabled them to spread quite rapidly. And we've got something like 1 million on the near continent now. I should have pointed out, by the way, the reason why beavers were hunted so readily to extinction. If you can't read the small print there, they sort of had so many things about them that people wanted, unfortunately. They've got one of the densest furs of any mammal, really, really dense, warm fur. The meat, believe it or not, some people would actually justify eating the meat because they classified it as fish. So even on sort of religious grounds, if they couldn't eat meat on certain days, they would eat beavers because they said it was fish. And castoreum. So the castoreum is the scent the musk that they produce from their anal gland, and that's a scent marking oil, and that was also harvested for things like perfume making and flavoring and things like that. So they kind of had it in for them, really. Everyone wanted a piece of them, but thankfully we've got a lot more now. And as you can see from that slide, the green, the darker green, is where they are, sort of broadly speaking now, but actually even that's a little bit out of date. And there is that little population of North American beavers as well in the top of the picture there, which they can't interbreed with European beavers. That's they've escaped from fur farms and things like that. And thankfully, the picture is now looking brighter in the UK as well, although it has to be said this has been done largely without license. So a lot of what's happened in England, at least, has happened without license. Scotland is a different matter. I haven't included Scotland here just because we're focused on the south of England in this talk. But the Scottish population, which is now fully approved, and there are wild releases. There have been wild releases in Scotland for several years. It's a really well managed population up there, and there's probably a couple of thousand. But in England here, as you can see, there's a real strong bias to the southwest. And something not everyone knows is that there's quite a lot of beavers in Kent. So the nearest beavers, if you want to go and see wild beavers right now, there's a population of potentially a couple of hundred or more on the Stour, out sort of Canterbury way. I've included this slide in here just because I had it from before the recent announcement, and it people found it quite amusing. Basically, we were not allowed to release beavers into the wild until very recently in England. And actually, if I just go back a slide, all of those little black dots there you can see are enclosures. So up until the end of February, the only places we could release beavers in England was into enclosures. So that's what we've done at Knepp, and we've had, as I say, this population in an enclosure, 6 acres, for about 3 years now. But this happened kind of out of the blue, sort of. We kind of knew it was coming, and we were hoping it was going to come because the previous government announced that beavers were a protected species again and a native species way back in 2022. And a lot of us that work in conservation and rewilding and species reintroduction were hoping that this would follow. And it's taken a little while, but we have this new license application window, which is now open to actually express interest into releasing beavers into the wild. And there's been a release already in Dorset. There's a National Trust site, which is wild, but technically sort of enclosed because it's an isolated water body. But they have released the first wild beavers officially since this announcement was made. And it has to be said, there's a lot of support for beavers. It's a really popular species. Lots and lots of landowners. Certainly, when I was working at the Wildlife Trust, and also now I'm in my role at Knepp, we have a lot of people who are very excited about this, and we have people reaching out to us to ask us all about how it is going to work and how they can be part of it. This is the kind of situation in Sussex at the moment. We only have 2 enclosed populations currently. And there's 1 or 2 other sites who have applied to release into enclosures as well. But as already mentioned, there's this huge population of beavers in Kent, so not very far away, and they're moving westwards. And these are ones which have got out of enclosures and or been released without permission prior to the new legislation being passed. Whoops, sorry, I've gone too far forward. This is a clip of the enclosure at Knepp. So this was actually filmed in about a year after the beavers arriving. I appreciate it's quite hard for you to know what it looked like before, but it was basically just a tiny little stream running through a bit of wooded field, much like a lot of the landscape around it. It was a rewilded landscape, so it was still quite interesting anyway, but it wasn't holding very much water at all. It was just a stream. So this is a year after them getting there. And that's what they've done in that short space of time, just 1 pair. And they've now had 2 lots of young. So they bred last year and the year before. And this is why we bang on about beavers so much. Those of us that are very excited about it is because of all of these things that they do. So the reason why we call them a keystone species or an ecosystem engineer is they produce a lot of really interesting positive impacts in the landscape really quite quickly. You can see there they hold back a lot of water with their dam building, The reason they do that is it's an inherent predator response. They don't know that there's not things that are going to necessarily come and eat them, and they're not very agile out of water. They're a big animal, as you've seen. So they build these dams, hold back the water, so they can swim around in the water, mostly underwater. You don't actually see very much of them if you see one at all. But the knock-on effect is all of these species which then benefit. We see sea trout in the enclosure at Knepp. We see kingfishers every single time I go in there. There's a kingfisher, water rails, Chetty's warblers, dragonflies, all sorts of amazing things. The storks go in there as well. And then there's all the benefits that they bring to the sort of wider landscape as well. So when you've got beavers upstream, what happens is the water's going down through those dams. It becomes more of a trickle rather than a torrent, and it's being filtered. The water is becoming cleaner when it goes through. It is reducing flood impacts downstream. We're not getting flash flood events so much. And there's more water being held back on the land as well, in terms of drought resilience. So the landscape is generally wetter where there are beavers. If you have wildfires, particularly in North America, areas where there are beavers tend to be pretty fireproof, as you might imagine, because they're more wet. They do coppice trees. You can see the one in the foreground there is chewing on the tree. That is because they're herbivorous. They want to eat the foliage and the softer bits of the tree, and then the woody elements they incorporate into the dam. Now, trees respond generally pretty positively to this. The beavers and trees have evolved for millennia, obviously, as have all of these other species. So generally what we're seeing at Knepp is the trees grow back when they're being coppiced by the beavers. Saying that, there are places where people would not want them to do this, quite understandably. There are places where you would not want them to hold back water on your land. So there's a whole host of mitigation measures that can be put in place. This has been done really well in Devon, where there are full-time beaver officers now demonstrating how we can coexist with these animals. There are payments available to people to protect their trees and being sort of reimbursed for land being held underwater for a period of time. The benefits that these animals bring are so massive, and in a current sort of situation where we have a lot more flood events and a lot more drought events, it is really a very important thing that we get these animals back. And the Environment Agency now acknowledges beavers as a natural flood management tool for the first time. So this is a really, really positive thing, but we want to make sure people come on the journey with us. So all of us that are working on beaver recovery, we want people to be supportive. We want people to understand what they do and explain how they can live alongside them in the most harmonious way. So I'm aware time's getting on, so I'm going to get on to pine martens as well. This is a different type of animal in terms of it's been gone for less time in terms of when it was last in Sussex. We only actually lost them in Sussex and in fact in England in about 100 years ago. So the last record anywhere in England that we're aware of was actually in Woolbeeding near Midhurst. So some of you might know that area very well. 1923. They were being heavily persecuted. So in particularly that Victorian era, shooting of kind of anything was very popular, and anything that interfered with that was generally kind of persecuted ruthlessly. And pine martens were seen as a threat to all sorts of to bird species and game bird species in particular. There was also the mass clearing of woodland. So this is a species that relies on quite large areas of connected woodland. That was all being cleared as well quite heavily through the sort of Victorian times. Both of those things, as it says there, stopped quite extensively when we had World War I, because obviously that threw a great big spanner in the works in terms of the general carrying on of normal life. And we also had the Forestry Commission founded as well to plant up new areas of trees to make us more sustainable in terms of our timber production. Fast forward to the 1980s, by which point pine martens are sort of starting to recover quite well in some areas. They are then given protected status. And they're spreading sort of out of Scotland at this point and starting to come into parts of northern Britain. And now we're starting to fill in the gaps with projects like the Forest of Dean, for example. And there's also a population discovered in the New Forest quite recently. We found that there's an unknown origin population that is thriving down there. So this is a flagship species. This is an animal which thrives in landscapes, as it says there, that are pretty heavily wooded, not entirely wooded, but there needs to be good connection of pretty large areas of woodland. They have quite an extensive range. They can roam over many kilometers within a territory, even sort of up to 30 kilometers can be a territory for them. So these dense wooded corridors, places like the High Weald, for example, can be really, could potentially be really suitable for them. They're not so much of a keystone species as beavers, but as it says there, they can be seen as a flagship for the habitat restoration and also things like seed dispersal and regulating small mammals. So the South East Pine Marten Restoration Project, which the Sussex Wildlife Trust is part of, and I do attend some of the stakeholder meetings as well in my Knepp role, is quite simply, as it says there, is the aim is to restore pine martens in the southeast. We have a population in the New Forest, and the aim is to sort of fill in the gaps. We've also got releases down in the West Country that have happened recently. So it's basically, because it's a slow-moving animal, it doesn't breed very often, or it doesn't tend to have a lot of kits. We're trying to sort of help by filling in some of those gaps. And this is really good as well for bringing people on board with the idea of species reintroduction, habitat recovery. So remember back at the beginning, I said about how it can drive positive change for a lot of other species as well. I'm actually going to rattle through quite a lot of other species because I'm aware that we're going to run out of time. I just wanted to talk about white-tailed eagles. Maybe some of you have seen one of these amazing birds recently. I'm really lucky to live quite near to where they reside in Sussex, in the Arun Valley. There's some that hang out down there. We didn't have these in the south of England since the 1700s. So the last breeding was on the Isle of Wight. Another bird, unfortunately, another species that was heavily persecuted at one point and lost altogether, but has been re-established in Scotland thanks to the Roy Dennis Foundation and others. And Roy Dennis has continued that work now into the south of England with Forestry England for this Sea Eagle England project. So as it says there, about 30 birds released already. This started sort of 2019, 2020. And that picture was taken in the Arun Valley. So that was taken in the sort of Pulborough area a couple of years ago. That's a young bird. Up until the last couple of years, all we had was these juvenile birds being released. But obviously they've started to reach maturity. And what actually happened was a couple of years ago, the first adult pair bred for the first time in potentially 300 years in the south of England, in Sussex, which I think kind of stunned everyone. They were still pretty young at this point. And then they bred again last year. So they had one chick in 2023 and another one in 2024. And the really interesting point I'm going to make here was the area where they sort of hang out is a place where we had a wild white-tailed eagle just about a decade ago. So it just shows you that the habitat suitability was still there. These birds, which have been reintroduced on the Isle of Wight, have now found it to their liking, essentially, and they've come here and they've settled and they're doing really, really well. And the amazing thing is how they join up with other species. So you've got, this is the bird, the first white-tailed eagle born in the south of England for 300 years, travelled with a GPS tracker. And that is what it did in 2024. This bird went all the way from Sussex. It went to the Isle of Wight for a bit, probably found all its friends down there. Spent quite a bit of time in Norfolk, where it also met another white-tailed eagle. And then it went up to the Cairngorms, and it's been travelling all over the place. And this is a couple of pictures that I took just in the last couple of weeks. So as I mentioned, I live quite near where these birds hang out. And on the left there is the resident pair that we see in this area. If you don't know how big a white-tailed eagle is, you might know how big a red kite is. And that gives you an idea of the size difference. They are enormous birds. And then on the right there, that's a picture I took this last weekend. It's one of the birds, one of the adult pair, with two sort of interloping young birds, juveniles, immature birds, which have sort of taken up residence in the area as well. Perhaps they're starting to think about their own nest sites around here, and they're obviously coming into contact with the other ones as well. Now, another thing that people might, consider with white-tailed eagles, for example, is they are a big predator. There's been sort of no reintroduction is without some controversy, and one of the concerns around white-tailed eagle was, would they potentially take a lot of livestock? But there was this really encouraging study published last year by the RSPB, which said all of the evidence is that the ones in the south of England are not feeding on any livestock. And I've actually seen them in this area around where there's sheep on the hills and things like that. And I've spoken with the farmers, and they're all generally really positive of the project. So another example of a really well orchestrated reintroduction. We now have breeding white-tailed eagles back in the south of England. I want to just touch on grey partridge. There's a couple of birds here. It's not all about birds, but birds are often chosen because they're quite charismatic and they're easy to see, and people sort of associate with them quite readily, particularly in this country where we have a great love of birds. Now, the grey partridge, or just the partridge, or the English partridge, is a bird that has sort of silently ebbed away. Like a lot of these sort of farmland species, they're not that sort of sexy, if you like, and people don't know that much about them. But partridges are disappearing rapidly in a lot of parts of the UK, and in West Sussex on the Norfolk estate near Arundel, there was a study done about 20 years ago that revealed we were down to just 11 individuals. And the Duke of Norfolk, who owns this land, was absolutely horrified. He thought, I'm not going to have this on my land. I'm not going to lose this species. And all credit to him and his team of the farmers and the estate managers. They've done an amazing job up there. You might know where I'm talking about, the sort of North Stoke, the Burr, that area. They've planted 30 kilometres of hedgerows, amazing field margins and headlands. If you go in the spring and summer, it's incredible displays of wildflowers up there. And there is legal predator control as well of foxes and corvids and things like that. Now, this is very loosely reintroduction. It's not entirely, but it is loosely a reintroduction because they translocated 9 pairs. So just 18 birds were brought down from Norfolk, from the Sandringham estates. Combined with that habitat work that they've done, they now have over 2,000 birds some years on the estate, which is extraordinary. So 11 there, that's the area we're talking about on the left, this particular part of the estate. And that is what it's like. That was within 10 years. And now some years they're getting sort of 300 breeding pairs, and those birds can breed, a couple of times, sometimes in a year. So you're sometimes talking about sort of 4,000 or 5,000 birds potentially. It is done for shooting. So this is something that doesn't always sit well with some people in conservation. The birds are shot, but they're only shot when they reach a certain surplus point at which the gamekeepers decide this is a viable population and we can allow shooting of a certain number. But they are entirely wild partridges, and they are living in this incredible landscape, which, as I talked about earlier on, has had all of these knock-on benefits. So this idea of you sort of focus on your main species of interest, but actually look at these increases in linnets and skylarks and lapwings and everything else. And birds of prey, you may well know, if you're interested in birds, if you've been to this area I'm talking about, it's quite possible to see sort of 7 or 8 species of bird of prey in an afternoon up there. It's absolutely extraordinary. And this book, which I really recommend, which I'm reading about it at the moment, is well worth a read. Something else that the same area, the estate up there, are working on is the curlew reintroduction as well. And this is a really interesting one that I was talking to someone from Natural England about last week. Again, a curlew, a species that a lot of people don't realise we are on the cusp of losing as a breeding bird. If you go to places like Rye Harbour or Pagham Harbour, you're probably very familiar with curlews, and you might think there's no problem because you see 50 of them in a morning. Actually, as a breeding bird, there's only 1 pair left in the southeast of England, so we are basically going to lose them any year now if we don't do some form of intervention. So that was the idea behind this project. It's only just started in the last few years, and they're very excited to potentially see if they have some breeding at some point. I wanted to just touch on white storks briefly. I work at Knepp, obviously, and I was also working as part of the white stork project a few years ago. This is another one that sort of caused a little bit of controversy because some people were unsure about the extent to which they were a true native species. But nonetheless, the introduction went ahead. Natural England said you're free to go ahead with it, and the time in which the project has produced successful breeding is absolutely extraordinary. So we had the first breeding from reintroducing the birds in 2016 and supplementing the population year on year with captive bred birds. We are now getting wild breeding within 4 years, and we've had breeding every year since. Last year we had 53 chicks from 18 nests, And the population is starting to spread out, and they're being seen in other places. We've had records of birds seen in Scotland. They're quite regularly seen in places like Cornwall as well. And there's been the first successful return migration to and from Morocco. Now, you remember I talked at the beginning about nature connectedness, and one of the aims of a reintroduction of species could be particularly to sort of get people on board with conservation and excited about the idea of species recovery. That is where the White Stork Project really comes into its own. It's been an absolutely fantastic example of that, as you can see from all of these here. School groups coming out, visiting. Our stork officer, Laura, goes out and gives talks all over the place to groups. And we have things like on the left there, that was the bottom left, that was a parade at the Brighton Festival a couple of years ago where the children all dressed as sort of woodland characters and they paraded a giant white stork through the streets of Brighton. And this is the sort of thing you can see now, not just at Knepp, but kind of almost anywhere in certainly the south of Britain, these sorts of numbers of them spiraling into the air. And we often, when we talk about species recovery, sometimes we can forget about the human element. And actually, it's really important to think about how we get people back in touch with these sorts of experiences. We once had a huge amount more abundance of species in the UK than we do now. We've lost a terrifying amount of biodiversity. And actually, people shouldn't have to travel to sort of other ends of the world to see amazing species. So it's a part of this is all about sort of restoring that wonder of the natural world in the UK. I am definitely going to run out of time, so I'm just going to rattle through a few more bits. It's not just birds. I know I've just spent the last 10 or 15 minutes talking about just birds. We're also looking at the very small scale. So these are some of the projects when I was at the Wildlife Trust, for example, and other organizations are working on or have been working on. Duke of Burgundy fritillary, that is a species now that's recovered really, really well in the South Downs, thanks largely to positive habitat intervention, so changes in grazing regimes and things like that. But also there's that potential for sort of helping them into new areas where they might not otherwise get to because there's a gap in the middle, as it were. Field crickets, one of the rarest invertebrates in Britain. There's only 6 sites where there are field crickets, and a couple of them quite near me, in the sort of Pulborough area. Pulborough Brooks is one of them, you might know. And this is part of that Back from the Brink project, which was the RSPB were partly involved in. And the wart-biter cricket, this is one that not many of you may have heard of. There's a potential project looking at these, restoring these to certain areas because they're only in a handful of sites in the south of England, a couple of which are in Sussex. So what might be on the horizon? What projects are kind of coming up? Well, redback shrike is a possibility you might have heard of. I'm going to just go into that in a minute, a little bit more detail. That's a great example of a species that is a flagship for scrubland restoration. We've had one or more turn up at Knepp in recent years, and clearly the habitat is pretty good for them there. Black vein white I've already touched on. This is another possible release in the next sort of couple of years as feasibility work and it's kind of getting to the stage where we're almost just needing the license. This will be a Knepp Wildland Foundation project if it goes ahead. And the Dalmatian pelican, this is a slightly unusual one. People might not be aware that they were in Britain, but there's actually a large amount of archaeological evidence that they were in all of the large wetland habitats in the West Country and up in the sort of fens and in Sussex as well. And black grouse I already touched on earlier. I think I mentioned I did some research for black grouse a couple of years ago. The last place black grouse actually bred in the south of England was, or one of the last places, certainly in Sussex, was Ashdown Forest. So we're sort of looking at the potential in the wider landscape and in other parts of the south of England. There's various people now still looking into this, but these are all possibles for the future. And I just wanted to mention a little bit about the redback shrike. As I say, this is a project that could go ahead in the next few years. Knepp Wildland Foundation actually have someone specifically who the last 18 months has been working on sort of habitat restoration and habitat connectivity. There was some feasibility work which determined that Knepp could support about 20 to 25 breeding pairs, but outside of Knepp, there just isn't that kind of continuous landscape of suitable scrub. So the idea being that we have this sort of thing. So the Scrubland Superheroes project has been aimed at creating more corridors for species like redback shrike to spread across the wider landscape. But there's a possibility there that it would need a bit of assisted colonization. So in order to get the project going, in order to kind of establish that link, with the habitat and the migration routes, like has been done with the storks. You need to sort of start with a bit of kind of seed population that can then attract in birds which are migrating back to this part of the world, and they're more likely to stay and breed. So that's the theory. And this ties into this concept of the Weald to waves. Maybe some of you have heard of this project. This is born out of the idea of the Knepp estate being a very, very healthy and robust ecosystem and lots of biodiversity. How do we then extend that out all the way to the coast, all the way across Sussex, and that bigger, better, more joined up, which came out of the Lawson report a few years ago. And that is the vision for the Weald to waves corridor. It's got bigger and bigger. It started out as just pretty much Knepp down to the Climping Gap, and it's now taken in 3 river catchments. We've got Ashdown Forest, and there's a team of people at the Wildland Foundation who are working incredibly hard on trying to make this a reality, because it's very, very exciting when you consider some of these species which are in tiny little pockets, if they're there at all. What we potentially have the opportunity to do here is to reconnect habitats and rejoin the landscape so species can move between Sussex, all across Sussex. Sorry, I've gone way over my time there. I just wanted to acknowledge that there's lots and lots of people working on these sorts of projects. Conservation now more than ever is a really kind of joined up affair. It was once upon a time a bit more kind of siloed, and people were working on all sorts of things in their own back garden. And now we've got this amazing coordinated approach, which enables us to look at projects like Weald to Waves, because you've got so many people involved, so many people, so many stakeholders. It's a really, really exciting time for conservation, and reintroduction of species is just really just one element of it. And I hope you have learned a bit about it this evening. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry I went over, Jane.
No problem at all, Matt. We seem to have lost you. Have you got your camera turned off?
I don't think so. Let me just check. Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, see if we can see you once you stop sharing.
What's happened. Oh, I think I did turn my camera off. That's strange. I think, am I there?
No, you've disappeared.
Oh.
Never
Weird.
mind.
I can still see you.
Yes, well, I think what we'll do is, we've got such little time left. It would be great to get a couple of questions in. So if that's okay, we'll go for a couple of questions if you can answer them invisibly.
Sure.
Just to finish off the day. So if I start with a question from Claire, and she asks, how and who decides which species should be reintroduced? With limited funding available, is there any sort of prioritization? And if so, is there a criteria?
Yes, good question. And yes, there is. I mean, kind of anyone can decide to pursue the idea of a species reintroduction, in the sense they can sort of suggest it. But of course, if they don't get funding, then and no one else kind of joins them in doing it, it's very hard to do this by yourself. We do have this situation, unfortunately, where there are kind of these illegal releases. I purposefully ended with my presentation with the links there, partly just to stimulate a bit of discussion, but also because we had this unfortunate situation in Scotland just recently where there were illegal releases of lynx. No one knows who did it and how it's happened, but that is not the appropriate way to do it. So the best approach to species reintroduction is when you've got a combined effort, you've got different people involved. It can be led by a private entity, which is what's happened with example at the Knepp estate. But you ideally want the broader support of lots and lots of NGOs, and that will help with funding.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question, I don't know what your horticultural knowledge is like, but it's, why is pigs rootling good for the soil, but with gardening, digging is considered worse for the soil?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So it all comes down to that idea of the being part of the natural process. So, I mean, digging in your garden is one thing, but if you're doing it time and time again, and you're digging that same area again and again, and you're generally using, a spade or even a rotavator, that is actually quite destructive, and you tend to go quite deep. Even with a spade, you're going, so I was doing a hand gesture, but you can't see my hand, but you tend to be going, a fair depth down, and you're impacting more of the soil ecology. what pigs do, and ideally in a pretty big landscape than your average garden, they're doing it on a sort of very sort of selective basis. And we don't have many pigs at Knepp. We only have between sort of 5 and 20 at given points in the year. So it's very gentle. It's only surface layer. They're only going down a few inches. They're not digging for gold kind of thing. So it's gentle and it's selective. That's the difference. And again, it comes back to that species evolution and coexistence. So there have been pigs, there have been wild boar in our landscapes for a very, very long time, and a lot of species have evolved with them. One of the things I always say in a lot of talks is the reason why robins follow us in our gardens is because they just think we're pigs. We're sort of behaving in a similar way to pigs. But yeah, there is a slight difference in the way we operate.
Great, thank you. And this is an interesting question. It said, could the North American beavers in Finland gradually displace European beavers, as happened with the grey squirrel?
No, that hasn't happened, and that population seems to be quite sort of contained. They're not really spreading very much, as you could probably see from that diagram. The spread of Eurasian beavers was really quite pronounced, whereas that little population of the North American beavers, they're pretty contained. They can't breed with the Eurasian beaver, and they seem to just sort of live alongside one another and not kind of threaten one another.
Okay, great. And I think we've probably got time for one more question. This question says, how are you planning to allow the young beavers at Knepp to leave their family lodge and find their own territories when they become mature if they are enclosed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we will later this year, we will trap those ones up. We have ways of doing that with beaver traps that we can catch them. It's all very humane. They will be sexed and microchipped, and then they will be moved to wherever they're going to go to. It's usually the Beaver Trust will have a sort of waiting list. They tend to be the people that manage a lot of these things. And they will have a project lined up. There will be someone most likely with a wild release license somewhere. It may well be in the north of England or somewhere else. Or, we don't know where it'll be. But there's a whole load of people that are certainly waiting for beavers, and ours will go somewhere else because they can't stay with them for more than 2 years with the parents. I mean.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much. I think we're pretty much out of time. Just to let everybody know that we had a lot of questions in tonight, and our Sussex Wildlife Trust Species Recovery Officer, Chrissa, will be having a look at your questions and will be sort of putting together some responses which will be included in future news articles and blogs on our website if you're interested. Just to let you know that at the end of this talk, you will be automatically redirected to our Species Recovery Appeal page, where you can support further work by making a donation. And that really just leaves me to say, Matt, I know we can't see you, but
yeah, sorry,
thank you.
I'm still here.
Right. I don't know what's happened, technology, but thank you so much for that amazing whistle-stop tour. I didn't realise that there was such a variety of different species introductions, and I hadn't really thought about the fact that some species coming back naturally is considered a species reintroduction. So I'm sort of looking at it in a completely different light. So thank you very much for giving your time up for us this evening. Thank you to everybody else for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening.